has been accepted to college, Redmond College, a fictional version of Dalhousie University in Canada. So this is in Nova Scotia. So she is leaving Prince Edward Island, our smallest and obviously an island province, to go to mainland Canada. Her best friend Diana Barry is engaged, and things are changing. But Anne herself is not so interested in relationships, and much to her chagrin, she has the attentions of a couple boys in town, Charlie Sloane and her former rival Gilbert Blythe. All of the Avonlea is sort of gossiping about a possible relationship, especially with Gilbert, because Anne and Gilbert have been quite close over the last couple books. And yeah, Anne resents these sort of feelings and keeps kind of trying to hold these boys at arm's length. And we see through Gilbert's eyes that he wonders if he could ever make Anne care for him. But Anne simply doesn't understand why boys can't be sensible anymore now that they've, grown up. So arriving in Nova Scotia, Anne has her first taste of post-secondary education and makes a brand new friend, Philippa Gordon. She is sort of flighty, but very delightful and pure-hearted, and Anne takes to her right away. Pardon me. But Anne is currently living in Patty's Place, which is a beautiful house that they are renting from an elderly woman, and she lives there with her friend Philippa Gordon, that she just met this year, as well as Priscilla from teaching certificate classes and Stella from her teaching certificate classes. And then Stella's aunt Jamesina, or Jimsy as they call her. But as far as Anne's dear friends that we have gotten to know over the course of the books, Ruby Gillis, her classmate, did die of consumption over the course of this book, which was quite sad to see Ruby go at such a young age, and sort of she was in denial over her dying, but eventually kind of came clean to Anne that she did know what was happening to her. And is not only popular, among her housemates and her potential beaux. And so far in the story, she has turned down 3 proposals. The first from her friend Jane Andrews on behalf of her brother, and Anne could not accept a proposal by proxy. That simply would not do for our heroine, who is imaginative and romantic and has these clear ideas. The second one was a gruff proposal from Charlie Sloane from Avonlea. And then the third one was the hardest one of all, and it was from Gilbert himself. But Anne wants things to stay the same between them, and the coldness and rebuffing makes it pretty awkward. But after all of Anne, turning these boys down and, kind of saving herself for her most romantic notion of what a relationship could be, a perfect Prince Charming has entered. And his name is Royal Gardner, or Roy for short. And he is clever, suave, handsome, and rich. He has spent time in Europe. He comes across as very aristocratic, and they start courting, which is all well and good. But Gilbert has also started courting a young lady named Christine, who has basically every physical trait we've seen Anne wish that she could have had physically. If we go right back to book 1, where Anne is upset that her hair is red and she wishes she had like raven hair. And she has gray eyes, but she wished that she had violet eyes. And Christine looks basically exactly like that. And Anne is not really sure why this bothers her so much. But this continues to chafe on Anne, and many of those around her are continuing to change. Diana just recently got married in the book, and now she will no longer be Diana Barry anymore. Philippa is now engaged, and Gilbert has not written or visited Green Gables once all summer until Diana's wedding comes around. So where we are in the story right now, it is summer break. I believe the third summer after she's started Redmond, and Anne has taken off some duties from a friend to be teaching in a near town. So she is boarding with an old spinster who is like 40, named Janet. And in the previous chapter, so this is coming up to what we read last week, we've seen Janet courting a little bit with a man, John Douglas, but she confesses to Anne on her 40th birthday that this man has been sort of on and off dating her for 8 years, but has never like made a move to marry anybody. And she just doesn't totally know, like, should I move on? Like, is it ever going to happen? And Anne tries to encourage Janet to sort of stand up for herself, but Janet really just wants John Douglas, so she's kind of willing to tolerate this. We also got to meet the old Mrs. Douglas, and she really doted on both Anne and Janet. And so there, she was singing the praises of Janet, and so we can't really narrow down exactly what is the holdup here with this relationship. And so that's where we're going to be picking up today. But one thing that's been a little bit interesting with, like, we're seeing Diana get married, we're seeing Janet speaking about her relationship, and we haven't heard the name Roy Gardner in a little while. So the universe has maybe been giving Anne a few messages about, like, what the nature of relationships are and should be and what they could look like. And I think she's having to contend with that a little bit here. There's a Lotad in chat, you guys. Feel free to pokey catch. So we're going to be reading 3 chapters of Anne tonight, and so why don't we get cozy? We're going to get our Anne music going, and then we'll jump on into our first chapter of the night. This is chapter 34. John Douglas speaks at last. Anne was not without feeble hope that something might come of it after all, but nothing did. John Douglas came and took Janet driving and walked home from prayer meeting with her as he had been doing for 20 years, and he seemed likely to do it for 20 years more. The summer waned. Anne taught school and wrote letters and studied a little. Her walks to and from school were pleasant. She always went by the way of the swamp. It was a lovely place, boggy soil, green with the greenest of mossy hillocks. A silvery brook meandered through it, and spruces stood erectly, their boughs a trail with gray-green mosses, their roots overgrown with all sorts of woodland loveliness. Nevertheless, Anne found life in Valley Road a little monotonous. To be sure, there was one diverting incident. She had not seen the lank, tow-headed Samuel of the Peppermints since the evening of his call, save for chance meetings on the road. But one warm August night he appeared and solemnly seated himself on the rustic bench by the porch. He had worn his usual working habiliments, consisting of very patched trousers, a blue jean shirt out at the elbows, and a ragged straw hat. He was chewing straw and kept on chewing it while he looked solemnly at Anne. Anne laid her book aside with a sigh and took up her doily. Conversation with Sam was really out of the question. After a long silence, Sam suddenly spoke. "I'm leaving over there," he said abruptly, waving his straw in the direction of the neighboring house. "Oh, are you?" said Anne politely. "Yep." "And where are you going now?" "Well, I've been thinking of getting a place of my own. There's one that suit me over there at Millersville. But if I rents it, I'll want a woman." "I suppose so," said Anne vaguely. "Yep." There was another long silence. Finally, Sam removed his straw again and said, "Will you have me?" "What?" gasped Anne. "Will you have me?" Do you mean marry you?" queried poor Anne feebly. "Yep." "Why, I'm hardly acquainted with you," cried Anne indignantly. "You'd get acquainted with me after we was married," said Sam. Anne gathered up her poor dignity. "Certainly I won't marry you," she said haughtily. "Well, you might do worse," expostulated Sam. "I'm a good worker and I've got some money in the bank." "Don't speak of this to me again. Whatever put such an idea in your head?" said Anne, her sense of humor getting the better of her wrath. It was such an absurd situation. "You're a likely-looking girl with a right smart way of stepping," said Sam. "I don't want no lazy woman. Think it over. I won't change my mind yet a while. Well, it must be getting. Gotta milk the cows." Anne's illusions concerning proposals had suffered so much of late years that there were few of them left. So she could laugh wholeheartedly over this one, not feeling any secret sting. She mimicked poor Sam to Janet that night, and both of them laughed immoderately over his plunge into sentiment. One afternoon, when Anne's sojourn in Valley Road was drawing to a close, Alec Ward came driving down to Wayside in a hot haste for Janet. "They want you at the Douglas place, quick," he said. "I really believe old Mrs. Douglas is going to die at last after pretending to do it for 20 years. Janet ran to get her hat. Anne asked if Mrs. Douglas was worse than usual. "She's not half as bad," said Alex solemnly. "That's what makes me think it's serious. Other times she'd be screaming and throwing herself all over the place. This time she's lying still and mum. When Mrs. Douglas is mum, she's pretty sick, you bet." "You don't like old Mrs. Douglas?" said Anne curiously. "I like cats as is cats. I don't like cats as is women," was Alex's cryptic reply. Janet came home in the twilight. "Mrs. Douglas is dead," she said wearily. "She died soon after I got there. She just spoke to me once. 'I suppose you'll marry John now,' she said. It cut me to the heart, Anne, to think John's own mother thought I wouldn't marry him because of her. I couldn't say a word either. There were other women there, but I was thankful John had gone out." Janet began to cry drearily, but Anne brewed her a hot drink of ginger tea to keep her comforted. To be sure, Anne discovered later on that she had used white pepper instead of ginger, but Janet never knew the difference. The evening after the funeral, Janet and Anne were sitting on the front porch at sunset. The wind had fallen asleep in the pinelands, and lurid sheets of heat lightning flickered across the northern skies. Janet wore her ugly black dress and looked her very worst, her eyes and nose red from crying. They talked little, for Jen seemed faintly to resent Anne's efforts to cheer her up. She plainly preferred to be miserable. Suddenly, the gate latch clicked, and John Douglas strode into the garden. He walked toward them straight over the geranium bed. Janet stood up. So did Anne. Anne was a tall girl and wore a white dress, but John Douglas did not see her. "Janet," he said, "will you marry me?" The words burst out as if they'd been wanting to be said for 20 years and must be uttered now before anything else. Janet's face was so red from crying that it couldn't turn any redder, so it turned a most unbecoming purple. "Why didn't you ask me before?" she said slowly. "I couldn't. She made me promise not to. Mother made me promise not to. 19 years ago, she took a terrible spell. We thought she couldn't live through it. She implored me to promise not to ask you to marry me while she was alive. I didn't want to promise such a thing, even when we thought she couldn't live very long. The doctor only gave her 6 months. But she begged it on her knees, sick and suffering, and I had to promise." "What had your mother against me?" cried Janet. Nothing. She just didn't want any woman, another woman, there while she was living. She said if I didn't promise, she's died right there and I'd have killed her. So I promised, and she's held me to that promise ever since, though I've gone on my knees and turned to her to beg her to let me off." "Why didn't you tell me this?" asked Janet chokingly. "If only I'd known. Why didn't you just tell me?" "She made me promise I wouldn't tell a soul," said John hoarsely. "She swore at me to it on the Bible, Janet. I'd have never done it if I dreamed it to be so long, Janet. You'll never know what I've suffered these 19 years. I know I've made you suffer too, but you'll marry me for all, won't you, Janet? Janet, won't you? I've come as soon as I could to ask you." At this moment, the stupefied Anne came to her senses and realized she had no business to be there. She slipped away and did not see Janet until the next morning, when the latter told her the rest of the story. "That cruel, relentless, deceitful old woman!" cried Anne. "Hush, she's dead," said Janet. "If she wasn't, but she is, so we mustn't speak evil of her. But I'm happy at last, Dad, and I wouldn't have minded waiting so long a bit if I'd only known why." "When are you to be married?" "Next month. Of course it will be very quiet. I suppose people will talk terrible. They'll say I made enough haste to snap John up as soon as his poor mother was out of the way. John wanted to let them know the truth, but I said, 'No, John, after all, she was your mother, and we'll keep the secret between us and not cast any shadows on her memory. I don't mind what people say, now that I know the truth myself. Don't matter a mite. Let it all be buried with the dead,' says I to him. So I coaxed him round to agree with me." "You're much more forgiving than I could ever be," said Anne rather crossly. "You'll feel differently about a good many things when you get to my age," said Janet tolerantly. "That's one of the things we learn as we grow older, how to forgive. It comes easier at 40 than it did at 20. End of chapter 34. Wow. We timed that pretty perfectly, actually, for the Stream Raiders battle. Thank you guys so much for dropping in on this boss battle. Let's go take him out. We have 9 allies on that battlefield. Currently, Aardvark is in the lead with most kills and assists. I think he's going to hang on to it. Great job. All right, that's another map down. And Aardvark and Arcaria getting our random rewards. Okay. Let's see. I think we can start down here. I need to kill some support units. So I'm going to get some stuff that can reach the back of the battlefield pretty quickly. Well, at least we finally have the answer as to what it was, why poor Janet was kept in the dark for so long. And it's interesting because Anne even brings that up as one of the first things where they were like, why won't John marry Janet? And she said, do you think the mother could be invested? But because the mother was nothing but like syrupy sweet to Janet, she had no idea that he had been sworn to such a thing. But between Diana's marriage, Janet's engagement, I guess being proposed to yet again herself, and then even when she arrived in Valley Road and had Mrs. Skinner, who's what was it, black mare wouldn't jog along properly. She talked about sort of having two suitors come to her, and one was a bit more of the like richer, fancier type, and then one who really liked her for her. Kay pointed out, I remember at the time, how much it was a little bit of a wake-up call for Anne. There is a Pokemon spawn here, an event spawn, and Anorith in chat, you guys. Feel free to Pokecatch. We have 2 more chapters of our warm-up story of Anne. So we'll probably jump on in to chapter 35, which is the last Redmond year opens. A lot of time has passed over the course of this book, where Anne was just starting college, as a freshman in the earliest chapters of this book, and now she is starting her senior year. Great job, Arcaria, catching that Anorith. All right, you guys, why don't we hop on in and begin? Chapter 35. Here we are, all back again, nicely sunburned and rejoicing as a strong man to run a race, said Phil, sitting down on his suitcase with a sigh of pleasure. Isn't it jolly to see this dear old Patty's place again, and Auntie and the cats? Rusty's lost another piece of his ear, hasn't he? Rusty would be the nicest cat in the world if he had no ears at all, declared Anne loyally from atop her trunk, where Rusty writhed about her lap in a frenzy of welcome. "Aren't you glad to see us back, Auntie?" demanded Philippa. "Yes, but I wish you'd tidy things up," said Aunt Jamesina, looking at the wilderness of trunks and suitcases by which the 4 laughing, chattering girls were surrounded. "You can talk just as well later on. Work first and then play used to be my motto when I was a girl." "Oh, we've just reversed that in this generation, Auntie. Our motto is to play your play and then dig in. You can do your work so much better if you've had a good bout of play first." "If you are going to marry a minister," said Aunt Jamesina, picking up Joseph and her knitting and resigning herself to the inevitable with the charming grace that made her the queen of house mothers, "you will have to give up such expressions as dig in." "Why?" moaned Phil. "Why must a minister's wife be utterly only prunes and prisms? I shan't. Everyone on Patterson Street uses slang, that is to say, metaphorical language, and if I didn't, they would think me insufferably proud and stuck up." "Have you broken the news to your family?" asked Priscilla, feeding Sarah Cat bits from her lunch basket. Phil nodded. "How did they take it?" "Oh, Mother rampaged. But I stood rock firm. Even I, Philippa Gordon, who could never before hold fast to anything. Father was calmer. Father's own daddy was a minister, so you see he has a soft spot in his heart for the cloth. I had Joe up to Mount Holly after Mother grew calm, and they both loved him. But Mother gave him some frightful hints in every conversation regarding what she had hoped for me. Oh, my vacation pathway hasn't exactly been strewn with roses, dear girls, but I've won out and I've got Joe. Nothing else matters." "To you," said Aunt Jamesina. "Nor to Joe either," retorted Phil. "You keep on pitying him. Why, pray? I think he's to be envied. He's getting brains, beauty, and a heart of gold in me." "It's well to know how to take your speeches," said Aunt Jamesina. "I hope you don't talk like that before strangers. What would they think?" "I don't want to know what they think. I don't want to see myself as others see me. I'm sure I'd be horribly uncomfortable most of the time. I don't believe Burns was really sincere in that prayer either." "Oh, I dare say we all pray for some things we don't really want. We were only honest enough to look into our hearts," owned Aunt Jamesina candidly. "I have a notion that such prayers don't rise very far. I used to pray that I might be enabled to forgive a certain person, but I know now I really didn't want to forgive her. When I finally got that I did want to forgive her, I did it without having to pray about it." "I can't picture you as being unforgiving for long," said Stella. "Oh, I used to be. But holding spite doesn't seem worthwhile when you get along in your years." "That reminds me," said Anne, and told the tale of John and Janet. "And now tell us about the romantic scene you hinted at so darkly in one of your letters," demanded Phil. Anne acted out Samuel's proposal with great spirit. The girls shrieked with laughter, and Aunt Jamesina smiled. "It isn't good taste to make fun of your beaux," she said. "But," she added, "I always did it myself." "Tell us about your beaux, Auntie," entreated Phil. "You must have had a number of them." "They're not in the past tense," retorted Aunt Jamesina. "I've got them yet. There are 3 old widowers at home who've been casting sheep's eyes at me for some time. You children needn't think you own all the romance in the world." "Widowers and sheep's eyes don't sound very romantic, Auntie." "Well, no, but young folks aren't always romantic either. Some of my beaux certainly weren't. I used to laugh at them, those scandalous poor boys. There was Jim Elwood. He was always sort of a daydream. He never seemed to sense what was going on. He didn't wake to the fact that I'd said no till a year after I'd said it. When he did get married, his wife fell out of the sleigh one night when they were driving home from church, and he never missed her. Then there was Dan Winston. He knew too much. He knew everything in this world and most of what's in the next. He could give you an answer to any question, even if you asked him when Judgment Day was to be. Milton Edwards, he was really nice, and I liked him, but I didn't marry him. For one thing, it took a week to get a joke through his head, and another he never asked me. Horatio Reeve was the most interesting beau I ever had. When he told the story, he dressed it up so you couldn't see it for frills. I could never decide whether he was lying or just letting his imagination run loose. What about the others, Auntie? Go and unpack, said Aunt Jamesina, waving Joseph at them by mistake for a needle. The others were too nice to make fun of. I shall respect their memory. There's a box of flowers in your room, Anne. They came about an hour ago. For the first week, the girls of Patty's Place settled down into a steady grind of study, for this was their last year at Redmond, and graduation honors must be fought for persistently. Anne devoted herself to English, Priscilla pored over classics, and Philippa pounded away at mathematics. Sometimes they grew tired. Sometimes they felt discouraged. Sometimes nothing seemed worth the struggle for it. In one such mood, Stella wandered up to the blue room one rainy November morning and sat on the floor in a little circle of light cast by the lamp beside her amid a surrounding snow of crumpled manuscript. What in the world are you doing? Just looking over some old Story Club yarns. I wanted something to cheer and inebriate. I'd studied until the world seemed azure, so I came up here and dug these out of my trunk. They're so drenched in tears and tragedy, they're excruciatingly funny. I'm blue and discouraged myself, said Stella, throwing herself on the couch. Nothing seems worthwhile. My thoughts are very old. I've thought them all before. What is the use of living after all, Anne? Honey, it's just brain fog that makes us feel that way. And the weather. Pouring rain like this coming after a hard day's grind would squelch anyone but a Mark Tapley. You know it is worthwhile to live. Oh, I suppose so, but I can't prove it to myself just now. Just think of all the great, noble souls who have lived and worked in the world, said Anne dreamily. Isn't it worthwhile to come after them and inherit what they won and taught? Isn't it worthwhile to think they can share their inspiration? And then all the